Now we move to our first panel of the day, Peace, Mediation, and a Transforming Order. This session brings together voices who have been at the forefront of conflict analysis, peace building, and mediation practice. Moderating this panel is Dr. Muhammad Hamas Al-Masri. Dr. Muhammad is a professor in the Media Studies program at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies. He earned his PhD in mass communication from the University of Iowa, where he was a presidential fellow. His research focuses on Arab media systems, news coverage of race, and the media and terrorism. He has published widely in respected journals and provided hundreds of media analysis for global outlets, including Al Jazeera English, CNN, and BBC World News. Joining him on the panel are Mr. Richard Atwood, Mr. Alex Duval, Mr. Pierre Crahambull, and Dr. Erin McCandles. I now invite the moderator and the distinguished panelists to take their seats and begin the discussion.
Can everyone hear me? Okay. Good morning, everyone. As you just heard, my name is Muhammad Al-Masri. It is my privilege to moderate this opening panel, Mediation in a Transforming Global Order at the Qatar Mediation Forum. This forum convenes at a moment when the international order that has underpinned peace mediation for decades is under intense strain. The multilateral, norms-based system built around the United Nations and international law is being challenged by multipolarization, great power competition, and rising militarization. The result is a shift from principled, norms-driven mediation towards something more transactional, where relative gains and short-term bargains increasingly shape outcomes. At the same time, we're witnessing the erosion of core legal and moral constraints on how wars are fought. We see the normalization of mass atrocities against civilians, including intentional targeting and the use of starvation as a weapon of war, and increasingly brazen attacks on mediators, humanitarian actors, and even host states. Our distinguished panelists have been asked to help us make sense of what these shifts mean for mediation. So the format will be as follows. I will first invite each of our speakers to deliver 6 to 7 minutes of opening remarks. And after that, we will move into a moderated discussion. So with that, let me briefly introduce our panelists, and I'll refer you to the program for the full-length bios. Richard Atwood is the Executive Vice President of the International Crisis Group. He has led Crisis Group's policy work, previously headed its New York office at the UN, and brings over 25 years of field and policy experience across the Middle East, Africa, South Asia, and Latin America. Alex DeWall is the Executive Director of the World Peace Foundation and a research professor at Tufts University. A leading scholar of famine, humanitarianism, and conflict, he has advised the African Union and is widely recognized as one of the most influential thinkers in his field. Pierre Crahambull is the Director General of the International Committee of the Red Cross, the ICRC. He has devoted more than 30 years to humanitarian work, including senior leadership roles at the ICRC and service as Commissioner General of UNRWA, bringing extensive global experience in crisis response and international diplomacy. Aaron McCandless is Professor of Politics and International Relations and Director of the Qatar South Africa Center for Peace and Intercultural Understanding at the University of Johannesburg. She brings nearly 3 decades of experience working on peace building, conflict, crisis, and mediation across more than 25 countries. So at this point, I would like to invite Richard to deliver his opening remarks.
Thank you, Mohammed. Thank you very much. And really a tremendous honor to be here with my very distinguished panelists and really in a room which comprises such expertise. I mean, I see people who've been working in this field much, much longer than I have, with a great deal more experience than I have. So it's really with a lot of humility I sit on this panel. Really a tremendous, tremendous honor. I think by any measure, it's been an extraordinary year in peacemaking, with the energy that the Trump administration has brought to peacemaking processes, to diplomatic efforts, to end wars around the world over the past year. Nearly a year in, I think it's interesting to ask, is the Trump administration reflecting existing trends, deepening them? Or is it, with its forays into mediation, is it bringing something new? Is it changing the landscape of peacemaking? I think if we go back a year, and we were having this panel a year ago, we would have said that, as we heard from Dr. Hanout, that wars were not ending anymore through comprehensive peace agreements. That the sort of deal that ended wars, maybe in the 1990s to some degree into the 2000s, where belligerents got together, decided a sort of shared vision for the future of their country, embarked on army reform, engaged in post-conflict elections. Often there was a mention of transitional justice, even if it was often aspirational, that type of peace agreement was largely a thing of the past. There were exceptions, Colombia, the Bangsamoro, but for the most part, a fractious world, a world in flux, made it very difficult to get belligerents to enter into lasting compromises with their rivals. Why compromise over the long term when the geopolitical winds might shift, when you'd have an opportunity to finish them off militarily? Instead, wars were either ending militarily, as happened with the Taliban's takeover in Afghanistan or Syria's civil war, or they were grinding into unstable ceasefires, like happened and is still continuing with the intra-Yemeni, for the most part, the intra-Yemeni fighting in Yemen, or where there were deals, as in South Sudan or Libya. They were comprehensive on paper, but never actually got beyond an initial ceasefire, informal departition, or at best, sort of power sharing, resource sharing, that a fractious world, again, was unable to move parties into actually implementing the deals that they'd signed. So I think we would have said that a year ago. A year into the Trump administration, can we still sort of say the same? Has this trend been deepened by the Trump administration's diplomacy? Or has there been something different in the energy that they brought to peacemaking? Maybe let me say 4 things. The first is that there's some virtue in the unorthodoxy. That the fact that President Trump himself doesn't face the usual political constraints of many American presidents means that he's been prepared to sit down with President Putin directly, not just position the US as a mediator between Ukraine and Russia, but position the US as a mediator between NATO and Russia, despite the fact that the US is a member of NATO. His envoys have been empowered. They've been prepared to speak to people that US diplomats traditionally haven't been prepared to speak to. They have a direct line into Trump. He trusts them. They're empowered. They can bring very quick decision-making. They can move very quickly. And in some cases, this has opened space where space didn't exist before. I think we can say this. The flip side of that, of course, is the second point, which is what many of, I'm sure, my colleagues in the mediation world would describe as process issues. that for the most part, these aren't mediation processes that are anchored in institutions, let alone a sort of multilateral framework. They're very personalized, they're often led by individuals, they're elite-led. And you can see this on occasion that the administration's policies are being debated and fought out as the mediation processes are ongoing. So you see this in the confusion over what level of enrichment Iran was going to be allowed, reported offers that had to be walked back. You can see this also in the framework, in the shuttle diplomacy that's happening between the Russians and the Ukrainians. This type of shuttle diplomacy, going back with a plan between the parties, amending the plan, going back again for another round of diplomacy. This is fairly standard. What's not standard is that the plans leak all the time. What's not standard is that it's playing out in the media the whole time. And I think this makes compromise, reaching some sort of compromise, if one is feasible. We don't really know whether one is feasible in Ukraine, but if one is feasible, it makes that reaching that sort of compromise much, much more difficult. So I think these process issues, and again, I'd be interested in what others in the room have to say about this, are a second feature of the diplomacy. The third feature, I would say, is the much more overt business interests that appear to be shaping deals. Now, transaction has always been part of peacemaking. I was talking to somebody who knows this field much better than I do last night, and she was saying the language of peacemaking is imbued with the idea of transactional. Interests, incentives, trade-offs, off-ramps. Of course, peace deals have always been transactions. If belligerents didn't get something from a peace deal, they wouldn't sign them. But the overt mention of business interests and business deals, that's a little bit different. The impact of it, I think, is still very unclear. The US is not going to be extracting rare earths from the Kivus or the Donbass anytime soon. It's not clear how these business interests are actually shaping the mediation, but their more overt mention is something that is a little bit different. And the last point, maybe to end, and it's probably the most obvious one, is that, of course, the deals that have been struck are not peace deals as we would know them. They're ceasefires, they're framework agreements, they're statements of principle. The ceasefire between Cambodia and Thailand didn't resolve the border dispute. The foray into mediation in the South Caucasus didn't overcome the main sticking point of the negotiations, President Aliyev's demand, President Aliyev's demand that Armenia change its constitution to take out mentions of Karabakh. The deal that's just now been inked between the Democratic Republic of Congo and Rwanda doesn't resolve in itself the future of the M23 and its control over much of Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. And the most striking example, of course, is that the Gaza ceasefire doesn't resolve issues at the core of the future of Gaza's governance and security. It ducks the main, or is ambiguous about the main sticking point, which is the sequencing of Israel's withdrawal and allowing in reconstruction aid and Hamas's decommissioning of some of its weapons. So these are ceasefires. They leave core disputes unresolved. They're starting points. I think there's two things to say about that to end, which is going back to what I started with. We are at a time when arriving at lasting compromises between rivals, among rivals, is much, much more difficult. And I think for the sequencing of peace agreements, for the sequencing of trying to reach a sustainable peace, the Trump approach is not out of tune with that moment, where if you can get to a ceasefire, if that opens space for greater efforts, maybe by the US, maybe by others, to build on that ceasefire, then that ceasefire is worth reaching. That is what peacemaking is going to look like now. What you have to do to get to that ceasefire and how you build on it, these are then the important questions. And just to end, I think the question, for many in this room is how other countries, whether that's the Gulf countries, Qatar, others that are involved in the US efforts, whether it's Turkey, whether it's some of the other regional powers that are involved, whether it's Europe, whether it's the UN, how they can create some space for themselves, should they create, if they want to, how they can build on what are temporary ceasefires, what are arrangements that don't resolve core disputes, how they can build on those either by keeping the US engaged or by engaging themselves to turn these ceasefires into something that is more sustainable.
Thank you, Richard. Very insightful remarks that I think we'll circle back to during our discussion. Alex.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mohammed. Thank you to the Doha Forum and especially the Qatar Mediation Forum for this really very important seminal initiative of taking forward providing a focal point for really a candid discussion of some of the most profound issues of our day. I'm going to talk about starvation. And I'm going to make several points. The first one is that even 10 years ago, we could have said with confidence that that age-old scourge of famine was something that was about to be consigned to history. The historic causes of great famines around the world had been overcome. Economic progress, trade, better governance meant that there was absolutely no reason why any natural calamity, any economic adversity would lead to mass starvation. What remained 10 years ago were what one might call atrocity famines, places where states had collapsed, where rogue regimes, where warlords were using starvation as a weapon of war, were causing starvation among civilian populations. And the international community, which still, I think, that concept still had resonance and meaning, were resolved on ironing out these last remaining pockets where mass starvation was occurring. And there was an effort by humanitarian agencies, and I see many of them represented in this room, by the United Nations, by international diplomats, by the World Food Programme and others, to develop and apply the norms that would allow those remaining incidents of mass starvation to be overcome, to be outlawed more than to be prevented, because they were man-made, gendered language, deliberate. So we saw some years ago attempts and serious efforts at the United Nations to adopt a resolution, UN Security Council Resolution 2417 on armed conflict and hunger. We saw efforts at sharpening humanitarian diplomacy in the field. We saw international criminal law being sharpened, with the Rome Statute adopting an amendment to prohibit the war crime of starvation in conflicts that were internal. So my first point is that this is a goal that is still achievable. One of the easier problems in the world is to end famine, and humanitarian diplomacy at a local, regional, and global level is something that can achieve that goal. The second point is that we are slipping away from this. The regress became evident in the last 5 years. We saw crimes of starvation being perpetrated in Syria and in Yemen, but in those days, at least there was an attempt to call out those crimes. There was a shame by those who are committing them that they should try and act more in line with these evolving international standards. And success was achieved, particularly in Yemen. Modest success, but real success. I think the first breach that we saw, the first real regression, was in Ethiopia, where the government of Ethiopia very successfully perpetrated a gross famine, mass starvation, and got away with it. It denied it. We saw it in Sudan, too. It is ongoing in Sudan, though there is belatedly, encouragingly, an outcry. But the key case, of course, has been the Israeli starvation of Gaza, which has been unfolding now for 2 years. And what we see is both an entirely political military catastrophe that still continues to unfold in Gaza, afflicting catastrophe is, I think, the correct word, and it has particular resonance for the Palestinians of Gaza. And the attempt by Israel to abrogate international norms with impunity. And I say attempt because they have not been entirely successful. And I think this gives us a focus for our discussion and cause for a degree of optimism. It was striking that it was the images of starving children in Gaza, images that were reluctantly transmitted by the Palestinians of Gaza, because those images were so humiliating, so degrading, that the Palestinians were very uneasy about actually portraying that image of themselves. But when those images came out, they did break through a wall of denial. They did compel the government of Israel to begin to revisit what it was doing. And when the ever cautious technical experts of the Famine Review Committee of the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification, a mechanism that is as cautious and cumbersome as that name implies, came finally to the decision that there was famine with reasonable evidence in August of this year. Israel was compelled to respond, and the very vigor of its attempts to discredit the efforts of the Famine Review Committee and the IPC, efforts that are scientifically unsound and morally deeply questionable. The very vigor of those efforts shows how significant that moral stain of famine is and how that is marking Israel today. And that denialism, I think, is signified by there is one thing that Israel could do if it were honest, which is to allow the data to be gathered, to allow the journalists, the humanitarian workers, to obtain the necessary data to determine one way or the other, is this famine or is this not famine? And it has not done that. And that, of course, casts every reasonable doubt on its denialism. But the final point I want to make is about the significance of the case brought before the International Court of Justice by South Africa, of which the humanitarian issue lies at the center. And the case, of course, revolves around the issue of genocide. Now, the court has not decided whether it is genocide or not. That will not happen until probably for 2 or 3 more years. But there are 2 things that I want everyone to bear in mind. The first is that the court has put the world on notice that the duty to prevent genocide has been activated. The Convention on Genocide is the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. So the duty to prevent is active today and has been for almost 2 years. The second is that the crime of genocide is not the crime of annihilating a people. It is the crime of destroying the identity of a people as such. And the crime of starvation is not just the biological experience of starvation. It is the social experience too. One of the first insights I gathered when I studied famine some 40 years ago in Sudan was that famine, starvation, is not just a threat to life, it is a threat to a dignified way of life. And if one listens to the voices of those who are suffering in Gaza and elsewhere, what you hear is the voice of humiliation, of shame, of degradation, of the destruction of what it means to be a dignified human being. And the question then arises, the question for humanitarians, for diplomats, for lawyers, for all of us who are humans, is what must we do to sustain the dignity, the sense of society, the community, the social relations, the very humanity of those who are afflicted by this experience and ultimately this crime of starvation. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. Insightful but sobering and certainly timely. Pierre, we turn to you next.
Thank you very much. We seem to be back in an age of war, in particular because of the way in which we tolerate the wars around us. it's always very striking with what ease political leaders, societal leaders embrace again the narratives of war. It's a particularly predictable human pattern where we begin with the glorification of war, because it is necessary to glorify the act of war in order to send yet another generation to sacrifice their lives on the front lines. We will then predictably shift to the act of dehumanizing the other, because in order to commit and justify the worst possible crimes against others, you first need to deny the other his essential human identity, dignity, and essence. And then, of course, once we have re-emerged at one point from the abyss, we will once more promise never again. So how many times we have to say never again only to return there again is something particularly striking in the work of the International Committee of the Red Cross and of many others. It is the casual nature of our relationship to war that strikes me after spending 35 years in many of the conflict zones. And when I speak of the casual nature of our relation to war, what I mean is that very often we have spent time memorizing the names of great generals, the dates of great battles, but we overlook the human costs of war. And this is, of course, was very visible in such graphic ways for the colleagues of ours who were on the ground in Gaza for the last 2 years and were immediately confronted with the brutality, the extreme indignity of that conflict in Gaza. But also, of course, for all of us who watched on social media feeds and through media the reports about what was going on. If one just imagines what it meant for an individual family to be displaced time and time again, to have somebody in the family missing, probably dead under the rubble after the extensive destruction of much of the Gaza Strip, to think of what it meant to not know of the fate of somebody who was captured and detained and placed in an unknown location. And this, whether these were hostages or detainees or others, was just the reality of that brutal war. Looking at Sudan, which has just been mentioned by Alex, it's an absolutely catastrophic scale of attacks against civilians, devastation of medical installations. In Ukraine, the ICRC has already to this date registered over 146,000 cases of missing persons, which is a colossal number for a conflict that has gone on in this phase for 3.5 years. And the list is long. We underestimate not only what happens in the war, but also the lasting consequences of these wars. Our organization continues to receive to this day requests from families in search of news and some information about the fate and whereabouts of their loved ones from World Wars I and II. So the casual way in which we are dealing with the current consequences is overlooking for how long we will be dealing with those lasting consequences. And this is exactly why international humanitarian law emerged from the realities of war. When the Geneva Conventions in 1949 that have the rules, contain the rules that limit the means and methods of warfare available to parties, protect civilians, protect the dignity of detainees. When these conventions were negotiated, they were not negotiated by idealistic humanitarians who thought that human beings are by definition good and will normally behave well, but you need some rules in case. No, these were negotiators who had just survived World War II. They knew exactly about our limitless capacity to inflict the worst possible suffering on other human beings. Therefore, they negotiated these rules. When we hear today politicians, parliamentarians, in some cases academics, even in some cases humanitarians, raising the question about the relevance of these rules in light of the challenges that we face today, we should remember what challenges the negotiators of 1949 had just survived. They had experienced everything from the Holocaust to Hiroshima, Coventry to Dresden. They needed no information about why they were there negotiating these rules. So before we cynically try to undermine these frameworks with narratives that are just there to try and give further justification for some of the crimes that are being committed today, let us remember that these rules emerged from the realities of war. We need to defend them, and actively so. And the reason why the important work that the ICRC is carrying out with the state of Qatar, and for that matter with other mediators, but I just want to highlight the role of Qatar in this regard. Over the last year, our teams have contributed, and most recently again, to the release of dozens of hostages and the returns of mortal remains of the deceased. We've also have the returns of Palestinian prisoners, the release of them, and the returns of remains of Palestinians back to Gaza or to the West Bank. And these are operations that only happened because of the mediation that Qatar undertook with Egypt, and the ICRC on the ground is able to carry out that last mile through our neutrality. And so it is absolutely essential that we re-legitimize the act of mediation, that we reinvest in negotiation, that we believe in the courage that is needed for political dialogue to take place. How often do we hear these days politicians declaring with great confidence and stating, we will never speak to the other side again? I can assure you the only predictable thing is there is always a day when you have to sit down and speak to the other side again. There are very few conflicts actually that have been resolved in recent decades through a decisive military victory on the battlefield. Ultimately, it is the negotiated path. And it requires far more courage than what we have seen in the last 2 years in the case of Gaza, in the case of Sudan, and many other conflicts. So the fact that there is such a tension re-emerging around the questions of mediation is absolutely essential. And I say this from the lived experience of all of my colleagues who are today in the most dramatic conflict environments of our time. We are not the negotiators in ICRC. We are not the mediators, but we need the mediators to come into these conflicts, and we can play a complementary role in providing the first steps toward resolution. And we call on that because every day my colleagues are the witnesses to the catastrophic human costs of war, and we simply cannot tolerate that this is what our future holds. It really is time for all of us to rediscover the humanity in the other.
Thank you, Pierre. Really important remarks, and I do want to come back during our discussion to some of those issues you raised, and especially on international humanitarian law. Aaron, we will turn to you next. I know that much of your research agenda has focused on a lot of the issues we're talking about today, so I'm really looking forward to your remarks.
Thank you so much, and I'll concur with Richard. What a great honor it is to be part of this panel. I think we've heard quite a bit about the increasingly dismal and challenging context that mediators face in terms of multilateral institutions weakening, normative consensus eroding, international law being routinely ignored, and at the same time conflict rising and military spending surging. And the rise of transactional mediation, which, as Richard also noted, is not new, but perhaps being legitimized in increasingly bewildering ways. This is, of course, where elite bargains and resource concessions are being prioritized above inclusive processes in the effort to find solutions to root causes and sources of conflict. With high costs for civilians, justice, and the sustainability of peace. So if we accept that there is a transforming global order, which is one of the framings of this panel, then we also need to ask how mediation itself is or can facilitate transformation. And transformation across disciplines, suggests the need to address structural drivers of conflict, as we know, inequality, exclusion, war economies, poor governance. It's arguably a strategic necessity where conflicts are being driven by deep and cross-scalar injustices. Really is the focus of this Doha Forum, and we should congratulate Qatar for taking on such an important topic and foregrounding it in this powerful forum of international affairs. Transactionalism and transformation, I would argue, thus reflect two competing paradigms shaping political settlement efforts. And I would argue the field of mediation needs to turn its gaze far more to the latter. So a critical challenge for mediation efforts within this context is that while there is policy consensus for a decade, at least, longer, but particularly through the UN resolutions, that sustaining peace requires addressing root causes of conflict. And while states are meant to have leadership in peace efforts and build national ownership over addressing sources of conflict, many drivers of conflict, fragility, and crisis are in fact not national, right? They're international, they're regional, they're external. These include, of course, a global political economy that tends to generate starkly divergent winners and losers, illicit extractive and resource-based economies, external backing of elites and wider aspects of internationalizing conflict, and regional and geopolitical competition and agendas fueling double standards in the rules-based order. And national level processes cannot sustainably resolve conflicts where incentives, asymmetrical power imbalances, and vulnerabilities are externally generated. This amounts to, or could amount to, what we might call an impossible design problem for those mediating conflicts, particularly so-called civil conflicts that are often deeply internationalized. So what then are the implications for mediation design? And I don't pretend to have all of the answers here, but hopefully these will be questions that we can really consider through the forum. And first is, I would argue, more attention to achieving inclusive outcomes, not just procedural inclusion, where much focus has been in recent decades. And Tanya Pfaffenholz here has done particularly important work in unpacking what meaningful inclusion looks like, where societal actors are able to really shape outcomes. And yet we still find evidence that inclusive processes do not guarantee inclusive outcomes. And in fact, South Africa is a good example of this, as is Tunisia. South Africa, one of the most inclusive processes of transition ever. And still today, 30 years later, we have higher inequality than at the time of apartheid. It's different, but it's still profound. And secondly, Tunisia, if we look again, one of the most inclusive processes ever. Nobel Peace Prize won for the inclusiveness by civil society. And yet we see a democratic reversal. Why? Well, in part at least, or I would say largely, because expectations around the types of inclusive outcomes, developmental outcomes, and participation outcomes have not been materialized. And people chose, not everyone, but enough people chose to reverse the democracy. Secondly is about how can mediation processes better integrate means to address international drivers of conflict, fragility, and crisis, many of which result in exclusion and inequality within states. So, for example, could we think about economic and environmental justice recovery mechanisms that don't saddle post-conflict societies with impossible, inhumane, and unfair debt obligations? Can we look at accountability frameworks for external interference and more robust alignment mechanisms to ensure international partners and donors don't confuse and overwhelm national actors and processes? And can we have mechanisms to expose and mitigate war economies and to finance just transitions to carbon neutral economies? And how can these be integrated with peace processes? Third, how should we understand and explore mediation as part of a broader ecosystem of transformative levers of change, whether they be legal, economic, diplomatic, societal, rather than standalone processes? For example, how might international legal actions, such as the ICJ case in South Africa, economic pressure on war economies, transnational social movements, or coordinated diplomacy meaningfully shape the incentives surrounding a mediation process? Certainly, this is vital in Gaza. And fourth, a transformative paradigm also demands, we think, neutrality, including in mediation, I would argue, where conditions on the ground demand this. My own work with Sultan Barakat engages the idea of principled impartiality. So fairness in process, but not neutrality when it comes to apartheid, occupation, and other crimes of international law. This is not that new. Early peace theorists such as Adam Curl, for example, similarly argued that conflict transformation requires lifting disempowered actors and parties and issues to enable a more fair mediation process. We need to revisit and re-engage these issues. So lastly, just a note on Global South and emerging powers, how they feature in this landscape. And we have a panel devoted to this topic, so I won't say much, but just note that my own work and that of others here, and many others here, highlights how the Global South and emerging actors, including powers, and especially such as South Africa and Qatar, are reshaping the mediation landscape by bringing their historical struggles that confer moral authority and solidarity, forms of legitimacy and proximity that Western actors often lack, and normative traditions that fall outside the Western canon that open different possibilities for engagement. And I'm working with Marie-Joëlle Zahara on some of this in analyzing how their efforts can advance transformative outcomes and notably sustainable peace. So I believe that the future of mediation and conceivably the nature of a rules-based order will really depend on how this paradigm struggle is navigated. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Erin. Very interesting, and I want to come back to some of those points that you referenced in our discussion. So we do have about 40 minutes, maybe slightly less, for our discussion. And what I'd like to do is just pose questions to the four of you. And if you can kindly limit your responses to about 3 minutes, that would be great. That way we get a chance to get more questions in. So I'll start with Richard. I have a two-part question to start for you. How has the diffusion of power and renewed great power competition changed the basic conditions under which mediation is possible? Does the more transactional environment reduce space for mediation or create new opportunities?
Very good, thank you. So let me respond to that, but also maybe first respond a little bit to some of the really excellent comments by my fellow panelists, which I thought were extremely rich. Maybe let me say two things first. I think, first of all, the fact that there aren't comprehensive peace agreements does not mean that mediation, diplomacy, peacemaking is not enormously valuable. I think this is what we have to keep in mind, that if the expectations are that to be valuable, peacemaking has to result in a comprehensive peace agreement, I think those expectations are usually today, unfortunately, going to be disappointed. Mediators are still playing crucial roles on many of today's battlefields, as Pierre talked about, whether that's about getting in aid, getting out hostages, whether it's about local ceasefires, whether it's about managing the consequences of war. You know, that type of mediation, I think that we have to be able to paint that as valuable and useful, even if it's not yielding comprehensive peace agreements. That's the first one. The second I would say on values, and I think it's really important a little bit to disaggregate. The first are the way that why states go to war and how they fight. And there I think Alex and Pierre said it extremely well, that we are seeing this terrible deterioration of the norms of conquest, for example, but also the way wars are being fought, particularly the use of famine, In many cases, on many war zones, the rule book being thrown out of the window. I think we can all concur on that. The other type of values, though, is in mediation itself. And there, I think, as you did, Erin, it's very important to separate out outcomes and process. My sense that the values in outcomes, most of the mediation processes are still largely aimed at trying, at some point, to get to comprehensive deals, at trying to get to civilian control of the militaries, at trying to get to a degree of franchise and popular representation, of trying to get to eventually some form of justice for the terrible crimes that have often been committed in wars. If you look at most of the mediation processes, that is where they're trying to go. I think if you look just at the mediation processes, for example, active at the moment in Syria, between Damascus and Israel, or between Damascus and the Kurdish-led forces in the northeast. The Kurdish, these are questions of decentralization, they're questions of the nature of Syria's democracy. These are questions that are imbued with values. The difficulty at the moment is actually getting there. So my sense is that the outcomes, it's not that the values have gone from the mediation just because there are different faces involved. I'm not sure how much the new mediators are actually new, but this is sort of what it's often framed as, that they don't come themselves sufficiently imbued with values. I'm not sure that's true. I think everyone is aiming largely in the same direction. The difficulty at the moment is getting there. The difficulty at the moment is getting anything beyond an initial ceasefire because, again, the world is not coherent enough, outside powers are not coherent enough to change the incentives of the warring parties to make them compromise over the long term. And I think that's a matter of finding the right opportunities at the right time. But I think we're talking about a question of sequencing. Do you wait for that moment before you enter a peace agreement, or do you try and get a ceasefire and then work with what there is on the basis of the ceasefire? And there will be exceptions. There will be places where a more comprehensive agreement may be more plausible, and parties simply don't want to sign a ceasefire until they have a sense of where the country's going. But there are many cases, I think, today where you have to get the ceasefire first. The second, so that's values in the terms of outcome. And then I think there's values in terms of process, which is sort of how mediation is conducted. And they're not norms, right? Because nobody signed agreements on this. There's guidelines that are put out by the UN, that sort of principles that mediation organizations know. And my sense is that these have been stretched a lot over the past 20 years, but they were never that strong in any case. And some of the principles like consent of the parties, I would say that one is still quite strong. And consent of the parties to some degree, impartiality is clearly eroded in many cases, but what mediators are bringing are influence, economic influence, political influence over the warring parties. And that's not ideal, but it can be an important factor when you think of impartiality. The question of inclusiveness, national ownership, these have always been very complicated questions with difficult trade-offs. And I think the fact there's much less lip service paid to them now, but I'm not sure how much there's a dramatic difference between what's happening now and what used to happen in the past. I mean, I think this is something that mediators are engaged in. There's people in this room that alone know much more about this than I do. But my sense that the values in the outcome are still there. It's just more difficult to get to them. And the values in process have been eroding for some time. And I think we're yet to sort of see the impact of what that means and how that's affecting sort of what outcomes you can get to.
Thank you, Richard. Alex, you've argued that the anti-starvation norm reflected in United Nations Security Council Resolution 2417, which you referenced, has essentially collapsed. What does this mean for the broader international order and for the feasibility of principled mediation?
So I think we need to look at the sort of the underpinnings of the collapse into famine, because it is, as I was alluding to earlier, the immediate triggers of it are political and military. And that's what Resolution 2417 was addressing. But the background to the vulnerability to famine is also economic precarity. And I think there's a very important link up here between this issue and between what Richard has been talking about. Between the fact that In the 1990s, we had these deals which were the public peace, new constitutional orders. In the 2000s, we had comprehensive peace agreements. But we haven't really had, despite our aspirations, anything like that since. And I think one of the drivers here is an economic driver. The comprehensive peace agreements of the 2000s were at a time of the commodities boom, the boom in official development assistance, and the money that was flowing into countries in order that underpinned those peace agreements. And underneath the sort of the constitutional public formula were a sort of win-win investment opportunities. What some theorists of corruption would be called corruption with exchange, whereby, yes, there's a corrupt deal between businesses and politicians, but the road gets built, the factory gets built, the services get delivered. What we're seeing increasingly after the financial crisis and after COVID and with this global economic squeeze are different forms of corruption. Corruption with theft, which is a zero-sum corruption. So that a peace deal may be designed in order to deliver, investment, but it is not delivering investment for the public good. And that economic pressure means that those who sign to finance their political budgets, to keep their political enterprises intact, are thieving from the public purse. Or even worse, we have corruption with robbery, where not only are they thieving from the public purse, but they are turning to thieve from the people themselves. And in this context, with these economic headwinds, we get the implicit economic bargain that underpins these peace deals is simply not there. And in that context, the norms against starvation become really the only thing that is protecting precarious populations from plunging into famine. And so I think we need to see both the normative and political diplomatic side, but also the financial economic context in which this is unfolding. So this points to the importance of financial diplomacy, economic diplomacy, commercial diplomacy in this very set of issues.
Thank you, Alex. Pierre, I promised that we'd come back to IHL, which you referenced. So the question that I have for you is this: when annexation, international humanitarian law violations, and attacks on civilians become routine, how does this affect the credibility and design of mediation efforts? And is IHL still a genuine reference point?
Thank you very much. So even if we didn't have the norms that are today enshrined in international humanitarian law and in treaties such as the Geneva Conventions, but of course also in many others, I think in every single society around the world and throughout history, there have been rules, customs, and others to the effect of protecting civilians or those who are not participating in hostilities, providing respectful treatment for prisoners, ensuring the dignity and integrity of children, women in environments of conflict. So it's actually what we have today is more a codification of long existing norms in every society, in every culture, in every religious context. And so even if we would remove these frameworks, we would still have those fundamental elements. But it is precisely because they've been codified that they're also so important to preserve and protect. And what I think, to build and work a little bit with Richard's point about sequencing, what I'm struck with is international humanitarian law, and that might be the case also for human rights law, but I'll focus now on the international humanitarian law. What I observe very frequently is that political actors will quote and reference international humanitarian law when criticizing a party in a conflict, but most vigorously when criticizing the party, paradoxically, over which it has the least influence. What would be far more interesting is to see political actors assume responsibility in delivering those hard messages to the party over which they have influence, which are normally their allies, friends, and close partners. That would be the beginning of a transformation. Because there really isn't very much courage in delivering a message to a party over which you have no influence. It feels good from a moral point of view, it gets headlines quickly, but it delivers very little outcome. When at the same time, one refuses to deliver those hard messages, our president sometimes says it, pick up the phone and call your friends. And we've had such a vivid display of that over the last 2 years with the double standards that are in such clear display when it comes to the same messages that are delivered on the conflict in Ukraine not being delivered in the situation in Gaza by sometimes the same stakeholders. That is what is undermining the credibility, not so much of the legal frameworks, though of course that is also a side effect, but just of political leadership. And political leadership is to deliver the difficult messages to one's friends and saying, I am your friend, but this behavior is intolerable because it's going to impact all of us in our security. And this is something that I just want to restate here. I was mentioning earlier that the Geneva Conventions were not negotiated by humanitarian idealists. Not only were they not negotiated by humanitarian idealists, but they were negotiated by states who struck this very delicate balance between national security imperatives and the fundamental respect of human dignity. Because they had seen, if you fight a war with the objective of total victory over the other, the dangerous world that we live in is going to become more dangerous. And that is why these rules are so important, to hold back some of these very deep and ingrained human reflexes that in the wrong situations can put us, any of us, into a position where we would commit the worst crimes to protect our families and to embrace a cause that we believe is just. So IHL in that regard has to be maintained, preserved, and applied well, but it requires that politicians have those difficult discussions with their friends and not just use it to criticize their opponents or their enemies. And then there's this combination between a reinvention, that's maybe to be said, of what conflict prevention and conflict resolution should be about. Because our organization was never established with the idea that we should be working for 70 years in Israel and Palestine, 50 years in Colombia, 40 years in Afghanistan, etc. The idea was humanitarian action should be an emergency response, a few months, a couple of years, then you move on to another crisis. That's not our experience currently. All of the conflicts we work on have been going on for decades, and that has to say something about the difficulty of bringing about, well, better prevention, but also long-term resolution. I'm also a firm believer in the importance of mediation because we see it on the ground. Every peace process has to start with some small steps, often brought about by a courageous mediation. I gave a couple of examples earlier, such as the ones that Qatar is really giving new impetus to. And South Africa was mentioned and others, and I think it is very true that the Global South is bringing fundamentally new ideas and perspectives to this, which is very refreshing and very necessary in today's world.
Thank you, Pierre. Aaron, I want to ask you a question driven by an article that you recently published, in which you argue that the crisis in Gaza may catalyze what you call a growing movement to realize a just and principle-based international order. So, given the deeply entrenched power asymmetries in international institutions, how realistic is such a shift? And what form could meaningful international justice take in the coming years in response to this movement?
Thank you. A difficult question. I mean, I think we're very aware that Gaza has exposed a profound legitimacy crisis in the international system. And this isn't a new, looking at world order or rules-based order revolution or change is obviously not a new topic, right? It's a core topic in international relations since the very early days. And debates have really focused around, you know, revolution or reform of the system, of institutions, with a strong focus on justice and order. If we think of Hedley Bull and the many critical scholars that followed, thinking about how this would happen and whether it would be stemming from, driven by the global south or other actors. So these are not new debates. And asymmetry of power has been there throughout, right? Quite strongly. And these debates matter for mediation, right? Because mediation relies on the credibility of these norms and institutions of this order, international humanitarian law, protection of civilians, and the expectation that agreements will be honored. So is this realistic, a more principled order? You know, I would say yes. International orders shift when their normative foundations erode, which is occurring, not only when material power changes. And what feels different, I think, about this moment is it's not just driven by the global south. I mean, there is a strong push from the global south, but it's also, we see citizens and social movements across the world. We see individuals emulating themselves. I mean, that's incredible. We haven't seen that since, well, we saw it in Vietnam. We see blocks of states aligning and converging in different ways and making powerful statements and taking positions. And all forms of different types of associations, as we know, and a lot of different types of legal actions as well, cutting across scales and sectors. And the environment really inevitably pushes mediation towards greater accountability, insistence on accountability, legality, justice, and on an end to hypocrisy and double standards. And it also, however, I mean, the positive side, I think, is it does offer apertures. Even though it is a crisis moment, it does offer apertures for us to think through these connections and alignments of these processes to better catalyze more transformative outcomes. And I think, yes, getting to Richard's useful point there about sequencing, we don't want to assume that mediation can do everything. We can't overload mediation processes. I mean, just trying to get a ceasefire is profoundly challenging, as we see in Gaza. Do we even have one now? I mean, it's a disaster. And I think we need to think a little bit more broadly about what we mean by sequencing, right? And again, you know, the ICJ case, I would argue, is profoundly important in terms of drawing attention to root causes of conflict and ongoing drivers of conflict that must be addressed in any, you know, in any effective peace agreement that really unfolds in Gaza. So, you know, how can we understand how these different processes, social and political processes working at different levels, are also impacting and helping mediation processes to potentially become far more effective and have the kinds of outcomes we hope to see, right? More assertive use of courts, economic sanctions, and public expectations. They matter, right? We should care. We have social contracts. We have some democracies left. We should care about what citizens think. And that must be held, you know, taken into account much more in terms of the way that politicians take action. And then I think, you know, just returning to the kind of world order shaping debates, right? I think we're going to see both, and we have to engage this question. We don't want to eliminate the existing rules-based order, but really think carefully about what do we want to save, right? And what do we want to protect versus, yeah, what needs to be transformed and changed. And, you know, for mediation also, this means understanding how these wider legal, political, and social forces come into play. So in short, yes, I think a more principled order is possible. It's going to be slow, uneven, conflictual for sure, but it's already happening. It's real. And for mediation, this moment reinforces something essential, that durable peace depends on the legitimacy of the order, and legitimacy depends on fair and consistent application of principles. And Gaza, as you know, in many other contexts, have made this impossible to ignore.
Thank you, Aaron. So we only have about 15 minutes or so left, so I don't think, unfortunately, that we're going to be able to get to my long list of questions, but I do think we have time for one more round. So Richard, let me come back to you. From crisis group's vantage point, how does the crisis of multilateral institutions affect the legitimacy of mediation processes? Are UN anchored formats still workable?
They would certainly still be workable if the warring parties and those mediating would like them to be workable. I mean, this is not a question. Part of it hinges on UN leadership and the ability of the UN to offer something that's different. But overwhelmingly, it depends on whether the warring parties and whether those that are doing the mediating want the UN involved. And this is the question. And I think this is not, again, something new. Over the last 2 decades, we've seen the decline of UN-led peacemaking. This happened first, I think, in Africa, where even under Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, the UN largely handed over leadership of most of the political tracks, despite the vast numbers of peacekeepers it had on the continent, to regional institutions. Demand from those regional institutions. So I'm not criticizing the decision, but that's just what happened gradually, more than a decade ago. So, I think it really depends on whether the parties involved in mediating, whether the parties involved in fighting, how much they want the UN involved. I would say that the Security Council resolution on Gaza was, of course, I'm not sure that the US administration would have wanted to do the Security Council resolution, but it had to if it was going to mobilize troops. The potential troop contributors for the International Stabilization Force depended on some form of UN mandate. Other Security Council members faced a difficult decision, blessing, in essence, a peace plan over which they would then have little control. But even there was a value in getting that multilateral blessing, that UN blessing to something. Similarly, in Haiti, although the current plan is not to send UN troops, the US has sought Security Council backing. So there are places still where major powers are looking for some form of legitimation through the UN Security Council. There's other places where the UN is actually leading. So Libya, the mediation that ended in the peace agreement some years ago, which again hasn't gone past. Much of the provisions haven't been implemented, but it has largely stopped the fighting in Libya. That was mostly UN-led, the UN working with others, a sort of outside-in process to bring about that ceasefire. So it's not that the UN is not involved. There's other places in Syria where it's providing advice behind the scenes, and there's places where it can provide frameworks or logistics, potentially in the Democratic Republic of Congo, to help implement deals. I think really the question and there's, again, people in the room that know much more about this than I do. I think really the question, again, beyond whether mediating powers themselves or warring parties want the UN involved, is what sort of role this Secretary General, the next Secretary General, is going to envisage for the UN in what are often unappealing ceasefires and processes that don't check all the boxes of the UN standards or guidelines for mediation. This is hardly a new dilemma. The UN deployed into Iraq after the overthrow of Saddam Hussein, but it is something that's particularly acute and is faced across the board on mediation processes. So what role is the UN going to offer to mediators? And then what sort of space are they going to create for the UN?
Thank you, Richard. So Alex isn't feeling well. He has advised that he may make it back. We hope he's feeling better, but I'm going to skip to Pierre. So Pierre, the question that I have for you now is, in these transactional settings, there's often pressure to accept elite bargains that stabilize things but entrench impunity. So they're kind of imperfect deals. From a humanitarian perspective, how should humanitarian actors navigate that tension?
So I think in a session yesterday, I think the foreign minister of Bosnia-Herzegovina mentioned that, of course, it had been very difficult to reach the agreements that were then those that in the Dayton Peace Agreement led to 30 years now of a more stable situation in this country. But every time that today they felt it was challenging to move through the political tensions that remain at times at the country level, it was still far better to deal with those tensions than the realities of war. And so I think you're absolutely right that, of course, we see it today in the Gaza Strip, we see it elsewhere. The first steps that are needed to move out of the most active phase and the catastrophic phase, the phase actually that will haunt us all for decades to come, of what we have witnessed, what has happened under our watch collectively, whether as humanitarians, politicians, media, and others. It is still far better today to be in the situation that we're in. But of course, it cannot be that it remains at this stage. If it's just that the fighting takes place occasionally every other day, that a few people are killed and injured, and that sort of lingers and remains the horizon for the next few months or even more, then that's a deeply unsatisfactory outcome. But I think what we see, what our colleagues witness in the Gaza Strip, is that, of course, there's a deep sense of relief that the worst of the horror is behind. Now, that also means, because we witnessed a moment like that already earlier in the year, where there was a ceasefire, which then collapsed, and psychologically, that is one of the most catastrophic moments to witness, because just when you think as a civilian, but also as a humanitarian in the context, that the worst is behind, and then suddenly it collapses, the psychological, the strength, the sort of inbuilt capacity of any human to cope again with another round is really something very demanding. So I think right now we're putting all efforts, also ours, modestly into trying to make sure that all the parameters of the first phase of the agreement are actually implemented, so as to not give any reason for anyone to return to a fighting and to the hostilities. But then, of course, long-term solutions have to include and address the fundamentals, the underlying parameters that led to this situation. Because if it's just to rebuild Gaza under the pre-existing parameters of occupation and conflict, then of course the big questions that led us to the current situation will continue to be raised. And that would apply to every conflict environment. And maybe it is because we tell ourselves stories about the wars of the past that we forget how difficult the immediate post-war is. And if I just take the reference that is probably evident to anyone, which is World War II, I'll just say it from what I learned out of World War II during my own studies, like most people. The war started 1st of September 39, ended, at least on the European continent, in May 45. And then we learned that the Marshall Plan came and everything went forward. But that's not at all how it was. For about a decade in Europe, every street and road was filled with millions of people making their way home from death camps, displacement, prisoner of war camps, looking desperately for relatives, not knowing what the future would hold. That took about a decade. And so we love to tell ourselves these reassuring tales about what wars are about. Brings me back to the glorification of it. And then we neatly package it as we emerge, tell ourselves all the things that need to be told, and completely underestimate how deeply we all will be marked. And this is going to happen to all of us, of course, first of all, to the populations impacted, but also to all of us, because today, nobody, in the case of Gaza, will be able to say later, we were not aware.
Thank you, Pierre. Aaron, another question for you. So we've talked a lot about getting to peace or trying to get to peace, but you've written a great deal about sustaining peace. That is how societies in conflict-affected contexts can shift toward more sustainable, resilient, and equitable systems without exacerbating social fractures. So the question is, what can and should mediators do to advance the potential for sustaining peace?
Thank you. So I think, the mediation literature is quite clear on the obstacles to peace agreements being implemented successfully and sustaining peace arriving. And this really has a lot to do with sort of design flaws, vague, elite-centered agreements that avoid core issues, capacity gaps in terms of being able to implement, and faltering political will. So, today, as we know, there's even more challenges coming to the equation, right, in terms of this increasing internationalization of conflict and international drivers of conflict and fragility and crisis. So this toxic intermixing of polycrisis that makes it far more difficult to think about how to resolve and mediate a conflict. So I would suggest that, sustaining peace is not just an appeal to do implementation better, but that's very critical. We know that implementation is vital. And it should not be approached as a technical issue, box checking. It's highly political. And so, we have to be thinking about how to reframe our thinking about implementation as a deeply political issue. There's things we know. Papagianni long ago arguing about unsettled processes of political negotiation and the messiness of political settlements. I mean, that is still very much in play. So we need to be thinking about the multi-staged and varied processes that shape a peace process. And we need to still maintain a focus on meaningful inclusion. What does that look like? And it's not just adding women and youth. It's also thinking about difficult actors, hard to reach actors. And that's in particular what new and emerging actors in states, Qatar and others in mediation processes effectively bring to the table. We also need much more focus on culture and context relevance, right? And we know this from decades of not very successful liberal peace building, right? We have to pay attention to context and culture. So what does that look like? And again, our emerging actors and states working in mediation are much better at this. They're not imposing Western templates. We need to think, how do we think about root causes? I mean, it's very difficult, obviously difficult, very contextually relevant, but in our social contract research across 9 countries, a common finding across every case study was the inability or ineffectiveness or failure to tie political settlements agreements to policies and institutions being able to deliver coherently and effectively on those agreements in critical ways. Right? And part of that is because you have competing concessions in peace agreements, all the details, the hard details are saved till later and so forth. And then you see social cohesion responding to that. You don't have the kind of outcomes that people want and expect. Social cohesion reduces, more tensions begin to arise, and we have conflict recurrence. I mean, I'm making it sound very simple, but these are common trends. So mediators need to continue to pay attention to these issues. And, we're all here, I assume, in the hope of maintaining a force that's going to, push back against transactional mediation, right? And continue to hold ground and try to, move forward and make the case for more transformational approaches. Yeah, I think I'll leave it at that. It's not easy, but that's what we have to do.
Thank you, Aaron. So I think we're out of time. I had a bunch of other questions, and then I thought up some more questions. Sadly, we won't be able to get to those, but I think the good news is we had, in my opinion, and I'm probably biased, but I think we had a really good, really fruitful discussion. So please join me in thanking our wonderful panelists. And thank you all for coming.